What remains when a man has gathered everything the world calls wealth and discovered, in the silence of his own palace, that his hands are still empty? The torches along the eastern corridor of Yerushalayim's great palace burned low that evening, their flames trembling in the windless air as if uncertain whether to continue. The cedar walls, carved by craftsmen brought from distant Tyre, exhaled the faint perfume of their wood, a smell I had known since my first days as a royal scribe, when I had walked those halls with wide eyes and trembling hands, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of beauty that surrounded me. Gold caught the torchlight at every turn. Inlaid ivory smiled from the doorposts. The floor beneath my sandals was polished stone hauled from quarries so deep that the men who cut it never saw the sun during the months of their labor. Every surface of that palace declared one thing: here lives the greatest king the world has ever known. And yet the man sitting at the far end of the Hall of Wisdom that night looked like someone the world had forgotten. I had been summoned by a servant I didn't recognize, an older man with cautious eyes who appeared at my door after the evening meal and said only that the king required a scribe. Not just any scribe. Me, Elnathan, son of Shaphan, 23 years old and only recently elevated from the copying rooms to the royal household. I remember the confusion I felt as I gathered my writing tools, my clay tablets, my reed stylus still stained from the afternoon's work. Why me? There were senior scribes whose hands had recorded the king's words for decades, men whose memories held entire libraries. I was barely more than a student. I did not understand then what I understand now, that Shlomo, the king of Israel, the builder of the temple, the man whose wisdom had drawn queens from the ends of the earth to hear him speak, did not want a witness to record his words for history. He wanted a witness young enough to carry them forward. He wanted someone who still had time to choose differently. The Hall of Wisdom was empty of courtiers, no advisors, no military commanders, no priests. The lamps had not been replenished, and several had already surrendered to darkness, leaving only scattered pools of amber light across the enormous room. I found the king sitting on a simple cedar bench near the far window, not on the ivory throne that dominated the center of the hall. He wore no crown. His robe, though still made of the finest linen, was ungathered, the sash loosened. His silver hair fell forward as he looked down at his hands, and for a moment I was certain I had entered the wrong room, that this bent figure could not possibly be the same man whose name made foreign ambassadors straighten their spines out of involuntary reverence. Then he looked up. The eyes were his, unmistakably his. I had seen those eyes in formal audience only twice before, and both times they had carried a depth that seemed to see through whatever stood in front of them, as if the man behind them was simultaneously present and already somewhere else, contemplating a horizon no one else could see. But that night, those eyes held something I had never seen in a king, and have never seen in one since. Not pride, not authority, not the exhaustion of governance or the sharpness of calculation. What I saw in Shlomo's eyes that night was grief. The specific grief of a man who has spent a lifetime running toward something and arrived finally to find it was never there. He looked at me for a long moment without speaking. The distant sound of the city, the last sellers calling their prices, a child somewhere, the low notes of a shepherd's flute carried on the evening air, drifted through the window between us. Then he gestured to the bench across from him and said, in a voice quieter than I expected from so large a man, "Sit. Write what I say. Do not polish it. Do not make it beautiful. Write it exactly as it comes." I sat. I prepared my tablet, and the king of Israel, the wisest and the wealthiest and the most celebrated man of his age, began to speak into the gathering dark. He did not begin with proclamations. He began with a question. "Tell me, young scribe, what is it you want? Not what you have been told to want. Not what your father wanted, or your teachers. What do you want when no one is measuring you?" I was not prepared to be asked anything. I had come to receive. I opened my mouth and found it empty. He nodded slowly, as though my silence confirmed something he had long suspected. "That is the first problem," he said. "We spend so many years being told what to desire that we forget to ask whether those desires were ever truly ours. I know this. I have lived it to its absolute conclusion." He looked at his hands again. "I built everything. Do you understand what I mean when I say everything? Not as an expression, everything. He rose from the bench slowly, the way old men rise when their bones remember too many campaigns and too many cold desert mornings, and he walked to the window. From where he stood, he could see the upper roof line of the temple he had built for the name of the Eternal. Even in the descending night, it dominated the city's profile, its stone pale and immense, the work of 30,000 laborers over 7 years, built to house the Ark of the Covenant, to give the glory a dwelling among his people. I built that, he said, and his voice was neither proud nor broken. It was the voice of a man reciting a fact he has examined from every angle until it ceased to carry meaning. I built it because my father could not. I built it because I believed that if I gave the Eternal the greatest house ever constructed, something would settle in me. Some restlessness would finally be answered. He paused. The temple is magnificent. It is still magnificent. And the restlessness. It simply moved to a different room inside me and waited. He turned from the window. I was writing as he spoke, my hand moving as quickly as I could manage, and I was aware that my breathing had gone shallow, the way it does when you sense you are inside a moment that will define the rest of your thinking. So I built palaces, he continued, returning to his bench with the deliberateness of someone conserving effort. 13 years on the house of the forest of Lebanon, the hall of pillars, this very hall where we sit. I filled them with what the craftsmen of every nation could produce, cedar wood and algum wood and gold and silver and bronze and precious stones brought from mines that required the suffering of many men I never met. I told myself that beauty was a form of worship, that excellence honored the Eternal. He looked at the carved walls around him. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I am no longer certain beauty is a sufficient answer to the question the heart is actually asking. The candle nearest me guttered and nearly died. Neither of us moved to tend it. In the silence between his sentences, I could hear the faint sound of the temple priests beginning the evening prayers on the hill above the city, their voices low and collective, a sound that had always carried a kind of structural comfort, the way pillars carry a roof. But tonight, even that sound seemed to emphasize the distance between what was happening in the streets and what was happening inside the man across from me. I pursued wisdom, he said. The Eternal gave it to me as a gift when I was young and foolish enough to ask for it instead of wealth. I thought that was my moment of triumph. I thought wisdom would be the thing that finally made everything make sense. He smiled, and it was the saddest smile I had ever seen on a human face. Wisdom shows you clearly how broken the world is, and clearly why you cannot fix it alone, and clearly how many of your own choices have compounded the brokenness. Wisdom is not comfort. Wisdom is clarity, and clarity, without something beneath it, without an anchor in something greater than the mind itself, can be its own form of torment. He was quiet for a long time after that. The city outside continued its slow settling into night. I stopped writing and simply sat with him in the silence, because it seemed wrong to scratch reed against clay when the air was holding something so fragile. I pursued pleasure, he finally said, and now his voice dropped lower, as though even the walls were not meant to hear this part. Every form of it. I told myself I was researching the boundaries of human experience, that the wisdom in me was observing and cataloging. I gave myself permission to go further than any man before me because I convinced myself I was going there in pursuit of understanding, not indulgence. I built gardens, vineyards, pools. I surrounded myself with music and wine and everything beautiful that could be purchased or imported or commissioned. He pressed his palms together, fingers pointing upward, in a gesture that looked almost like prayer. And at the center of all that abundance, I was more alone than I have ever been in my life. Not the loneliness of isolation, the loneliness of someone who has 1,000 people around him and has never once been truly known by any of them. I put down my stylus, not from weariness, from the sudden cold recognition that I was hearing my own future described to me. The future I had been quietly assembling, the calculations I had been making in my own young heart about what I would accumulate, what position I would reach, what recognition I would eventually earn. I had not yet begun to pursue those things in earnest, but I had already made the interior decision to pursue them, and the man across from me was telling me, with the authority of one who had run that entire race and crossed the finish line, that there was nothing at the end of the road I was planning to take. The king noticed that I had stopped writing. He looked at me with those ancient, grief-carved eyes, and something in his expression softened, not with pity, with recognition. "You understand something of what I'm saying," he said. It was not a question. "I think so," I said, which was the most honest answer I had. He nodded. "Then write this carefully. What I am about to say is the thing I should have understood at the beginning, and it took me until the end to learn it. Not because it is difficult, because it is simple. And we resist simple things when we are young and certain. We require complexity as evidence of depth. We mistake difficulty for meaning." He stood again, but this time he moved to the center of the hall, where the largest lamp still burned steadily. He stood in its light and looked upward for a long moment, and I had the sudden sensation of being present at something that was not entirely about me, or even entirely about him. That the conversation had widened without warning to include something invisible and immense. "Vanity," he said, and the word came out of him like a breath he had been holding for years. "Vanity of vanities. I have chased the wind. I built empires of achievement and filled them with the finest things the world could produce, and in the end the wind cannot be caught, and the empires do not travel with you past the last gate. Every treasury I accumulated will be distributed to men I have not met. Every palace will eventually belong to someone who did not labor to build it. Every poem of wisdom I composed has already outlived my understanding of its own meaning." He turned and looked directly at me. "None of this is tragedy. This is simply the truth about what we call wealth." He came back to the bench and sat heavily, and for a moment he seemed not like a king at all, but like a man who has walked a very long way and is grateful for the chance to be still. "I will tell you what cannot be taken," he said. "I will tell you what I have spent my entire life discovering, and what I should have simply believed when the Eternal told it to me, before I had yet made my first mistake." I took up my stylus again. "The fear of the Eternal," he said quietly. "Not terror, not performance, not the building of temples to earn approval. The genuine orientation of the self toward what is actually true. That there is a creator, that the creature is answerable to the creator, and that every choice made in light of that reality carries a weight and a meaning that no achievement, no pleasure, no accumulation of wisdom can provide on its own." He paused. "This is not a religious recitation. I am not telling you to keep the commandments because a scribe wrote them down. I am telling you that I spent a lifetime testing every alternative and found them all hollow. Not because the alternatives were without beauty. Some of them were magnificent. But magnificence without root does not survive the first serious wind." He leaned forward slightly. "The wealth that money cannot buy is this: to know who you are in relation to the one who made you. To do the work in front of you, whatever work, grand or small, as if it matters not because the world applauds it, but because the one who sees in secret sees it and calls it good. To love the people around you not as an investment or a strategy, but because you recognize in them the same breath of life that animates you. To sleep at the end of the day without the frantic counting of what you have accumulated and what you still lack." He sat back. "Peace, not the peace of having solved everything. The peace of having surrendered the need to solve everything. There is a difference, and it is the difference between a life that exhausts itself and a life that is held." A long silence fell over the hall. I did not write immediately. I let the words settle first, the way you let rain settle into dry ground before you walk across it. Outside, the priests had finished their evening prayers. The torches were burning lower. Somewhere in the palace, a door closed, and then there was only the small sound of the night wind beginning to move through the cedars of the courtyard below. "I have written much," the king said finally, his voice now carrying the quality of embers rather than flame, still warm but quieter, closer to the ground. "The books will remain. Read them, not as the words of a king, but as the testament of a man who looked everywhere else before he looked at the only place the answer had always been." He settled back against the wall, and his eyes grew distant, not with vacancy, but with a kind of soft return to something interior, something that had apparently been waiting for him. "There is still time," he said, almost to himself. "For you. You have so much time. You have so much." I looked down at my tablets. I had recorded everything, every word, every pause, every shift in his voice. I had recorded the greatest king of Israel sitting in a nearly dark room, stripped of all the symbols of his power, telling a young scribe that the most important thing he had ever possessed could not be found in a single treasury, a single garden, a single moment of famous wisdom, that it had been available to him at the beginning, before all of it, and that it would have cost him nothing, that it still cost nothing, that it was still available. When I looked up, the king's eyes were closed, not in sleep, in something quieter than sleep. The lamp between us wavered once and then steadied, throwing soft gold light across his face. And in that light, for the first time all evening, he did not look like a man haunted by everything he had pursued and lost. He looked finally like a man who had put something down, something very heavy, something he had been carrying so long he had forgotten it had a weight. I did not speak. I did not move. I sat with him in the silence of that enormous, nearly dark hall, in the city that bore his father's name, beneath the temple he had built for a name he had briefly confused with his own ambitions. And I understood, in the way that understanding sometimes arrives, not as an argument but as a recognition, that I was holding in my hands something more precious than anything in those treasury rooms below us, more precious than the gold of Ophir, more enduring than the cedar of Lebanon, more valuable than the famous wisdom engraved in silver and sent to foreign courts as gifts. I was holding the truth that a man only tells when he has nothing left to protect. There is a question worth sitting with long after you have closed this story. What are you building right now, and what do you believe it will give you when it is finished? Not because building is wrong. Shlomo built the temple, and the temple was real and beautiful, and it housed the presence. But what are you placing at the center of your building? What is the thing you believe will finally settle the restlessness? Because if that thing is anything other than an honest relationship with the one who placed the restlessness in you to begin with, then you are, like the king, chasing the wind. And the wind is very fast, and the chase is very long, and the finish line has nothing on the other side of it except the beginning of wisdom, which was available to you all along, free of charge, requiring nothing but the willingness to stop running and turn around. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. Keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of the human being. Not the conclusion a great king reaches reluctantly at the end of a long, brilliant, exhausting, magnificent, ultimately hollow life. The beginning, the only beginning that holds. I left the hall of wisdom before the last lamp went out. I walked through the silent cedar corridors, past the gold and the ivory and the inlaid stone, out into the night air of Jerusalem. Above me, the stars were doing what they had always done, indifferent to the accumulated wealth of every civilization that had ever tried to reach them. The wind moved through the olive trees on the slope below the city. I carried my tablets home, and I never stopped carrying what was written on them. This narrative is based on accounts from sacred scriptures, particularly the books of Kings, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. Images and videos generated by artificial intelligence were used to illustrate and dramatize the biblical events portrayed.